Welcome back. We're in the third section of the module in your online grant training focusing on compelling program design elements. As a reminder, in the first section we talked about logic models. We looked at theory of change, which is our very broad, if we do this, we get that. And then we looked at our program design logic model and we thought about our inputs and resources, our activities, our outputs, our short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. In this second section, we talked about our SMART objectives. We looked at having a broad programmatic goal, and then what would be SMART objectives? Objectives that were specific, measurable, attainable or achievable, relevant or realistic, and time limited. What would those objectives look like if they had all 5 elements present? The big link between both of these is that as we think about designing logic models and writing SMART objectives, these are program design details. This is a way we are presenting our programmatic information, our ideas about our methodologies to grant makers so that it's easiest for them to digest our very complex organization, our very complex program design as quickly as possible. So the third program design element that we're going to look at, it's about the work plan. What are the elements in a work plan that are critical to give the grant maker, the grant reviewer, even more detail? As you have brought them into your program design, starting first with that high-level overview, bringing them through a generalized goal, bringing them into your specifics within the objectives, the reviewers really want to now know, what are the things you're going to do? Help us build out those activities from your logic model. Tell us who's going to do them and when are they going to be done. Let's make sure we understand all the details. As a result of having these 3 program design details and elements clearly laid out for reviewers, a reviewer will probably be able to visualize what does your program or project look like. Will they understand every last little detail, all the nitty-gritty? Absolutely not. Will they be more than dangerously knowledgeable as a result? Absolutely. Now, when we think about work plans, ranging from foundation grants up through large federal government applications, we see work plans required in a wide range of applications. And sometimes when we see work plans required, sometimes the grant maker gives you a template. Other times, the grant maker simply asks for a work plan, maybe as a separate attachment, maybe within the body of a narrative. The purpose of the work plan is to help connect those dots. What do we have in our logic model in terms of activities? We're going to help flush those out, give some more understanding of those activities, and how do those activities connect to things like our goal and our SMART objectives. So if you go back in time, think back perhaps to childhood when you would complete a dot-to-dot drawing or something in a coloring book, and we would trace our numbers, starting at the number 1 all the way until whatever shape we were outlining was clear. The work plan is going to help ensure that we have connected all of the dots for our image, for our program, our project design. So here are some of the things that you want to ensure that your key activities include. You see how we've got more of that hierarchy? We talked about our goal in that last section. We talked about our SMART objectives and our activities. They are below. They fall from the objectives. And so we are getting deeper in detail the further down this hierarchy we come. So our key activities, these should be presented so that they relate to, they make sense with our SMART objectives. And so broadly, some of the things that are included in key activities, what are the planning activities that your organization needs to undertake in order to be able to implement? Do you need to work with an architect? Do you need to work with some collaborative partners? What are some of the plans that need to happen? so that maybe your next activity is something related to design. Do you need to do some validation and some evaluation work to prove that this is going to be the idea you implement? You may or may not have a lot of activities in planning and design. Each organization, each project and program is going to have a different starting point as you think about your work plan for a very specific grant opportunity. That's okay. If you can say, we've already done the planning, we've already done the design, then your key activities might start at the implementation stage. You could say, we're shovel ready. We're ready to go the minute we get the grant funding. Implementation of the big idea. Okay, this is the largest of the key activities. What are all the things related to implementation? I'm guessing it's probably a very long list of all the things, and that's okay. This is where you're providing the meat of your design so that your reviewers who have followed you through your program design elements, wow, they are having such deep understanding as a result of not only seeing the activities listed in your logic model, but by now starting to get additional details about who's going to do the work and when it will happen. So we've got our implementation. We might talk about some execution of our ideas, of our initial plans. We definitely want to include activities related to evaluation. That way, our grant makers, our reviewers will feel confident that as we talk about short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes in our logic model, now we'll know in the grant award period, what activities are we going to take part in, are we going to conduct, so that we can report on short-term outcomes. Or maybe, depending on the length of the grant award, so that we can report on intermediate outcomes. Depending on your grant award period, the length of time covered by the grant, you might not get to a key activity related to long-term outcomes. The grant might end before you would ever start to measure long-term outcomes. In that case, we may have shown the theoretical long-term outcomes in our logic model, but because of the grant award length, we might not be representing long-term outcomes within our work plan. That's okay. The work plan is covering a specific period of time. As we think about those key activities, what is the level of detail? What is the level of depth that we should be going in listing all the things that we're going to do during a grant award period? Now, I did air quotes around all the things because it's not a task list that we're trying to generate for the key activities that are included in our work plan. That is too much detail. What we're trying to do is think about maybe a compilation, a conglomerate of tasks, things that when combined add value to the reviewer's understanding of the project or program. They're things that might lead to something that could be measured, something we would see an indicator for, and things that are, as a group, when combined, things that might result in an output that could be counted, that could be measured, something that might have a related short-term or intermediate outcome that we could watch for that indicator of. So when we look at our key activities in a work plan, my caution to you is to not go so deep that you are talking about individual tasks. Rather, we're thinking about key activities as a conglomerate of some of our tasks that will be done. We want to be up one level, bundle a few tasks together into a key activity. The reality is that you probably won't have room in the template or within the length of the narrative to get into the detailed tasks, but it's something I want to caution you against so that you're not going so deep, getting too far into the weeds and taking up precious space within your overall application, because honestly, those tasks, that's not the level the reviewers and the grant makers are looking for, and it would detract from their understanding of the rest of the application. I wanted to show you a few specific templates that we've encountered over time that Well, can help you brainstorm so that if a grant maker doesn't give you a specific template, you have some ideas on what you could fall back onto within your application. So on the screen is a very basic work plan structure. You could lay out the goal so that it's very clear what are these activities under the specific goal. Lots of visual connection here by having that laid out this way. We could have our activities documented and then provide who's responsible, what's the timeline, what's the measure of performance, what outcome from our logic model does it connect to. We could even, depending on the structure of our program or project, potentially show the cost. Now, this has got a lot of information in it, and depending on the format available to you, it might not be the best fit. At a minimum, I would want to see activities, responsible staff, and completion of timeline. If you were trying to create a work plan within a narrative, those are the 3 things at a minimum from this example that I would suggest you start with. But sometimes grant makers, SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, is a great example of an organization that requires a work plan and a narrative but does not give a template in most scenarios. Instead, they tell you the minimum key information that you should include. What you should do is create a table within the body of your narrative using their minimum requirements as your headings. Coming back to a table like this, again, a great way that you could quickly start drafting a structure if a grant maker requires a work plan but doesn't give you even the headings. You might return to an idea like this. Now, these are rather simple tables. There are some slightly more complicated templates that we've seen over time. And what I want to do is show you an example. This is from a Health and Human Services teenage pregnancy prevention program that was out a few years ago. And what they did, they gave 2 templates that applicants could choose from for creating and presenting their work plan. That's a little bit different to see 2 examples. So how do you, as the applicant, how do you handle that? How do you make a choice? Well, I will promise as we flip between the first example on your screen now and the second, which I'll pull up in a moment, the information requested is exactly the same. So it wasn't that you were picking the level of detail you would provide in the work plan. Rather, it was about the way in which your story would be presented and potentially understood by the grant maker. How would you decide? Well, in this example, if you look at the lower right-hand corner of your screen, you can see activity timeline. And it has letter A, and then there was space. In this situation, what you would do is call out the activity timeline with a small amount of text. Something like monthly, quarterly, bi-weekly. It wasn't a drop-down. You'd have to make those choices on your own for what you would type in. But you weren't typing a whole sentence, there was room for a tiny phrase articulating what was the timeline. Well, that certainly is one way to present the timeline for a project or program. The second template, very different structure though. The activity laid out as the individual rows now has a timeline right there in the middle, with each month of the grant award period called out by the first letter for the month that it would happen. So the grant award period would start in September, so the first column was an S, then an O for October, an N for November, and so on. This is a very different style than typing the word or the phrase bi-monthly, weekly, quarterly, etc. into that activity timeline box in the lower right-hand side in the last example. Rather here, we would perhaps put an X or a dash. We would indicate in each individual month when might these varied activities, when would they happen? Well, how would we pick between one and the other? If your activities, if most of them were happening on a similar cadence, they were mostly happening monthly, they were mostly happening bi-weekly, if there wasn't a lot of variation across the types of activities with the timelines, that first example with the text-based timeline answer may have been acceptable. It may have been okay for a reviewer to understand and digest, maybe even visualize what the grant year would look like. But if you had a number of different activities and they were all happening at different times of year, one's weekly, one's bi-weekly, one's monthly, one's quarterly, and some things annually, wow, that's a lot for the reviewer to digest and try to visualize. So typing those activities out in the second column and then making some mark, the X, a hash, some indicator in each of the months in this timeline chart would make it much easier for a reviewer to look at that center section and say, oh, I get it. Okay, here's what this project or program might look like over the course of the award period. Here's when they're really engaged. Here's where things are quieter, or whatever the case might be. So that's the idea for how you would decide between using those two different templates. The lesson you learn in choosing between those templates, maybe something even came to mind for you, for one of your projects or programs. If you were forced to think about these two templates and make a choice, which one would you use? It doesn't have to be about teenage pregnancy prevention. It could be for any project or program. As you look at these two templates and the theory about why would you pick one versus the other, if your project or program you're applying for is going to be looking for grant funding again in the future, and you encounter a grant maker, an opportunity where they want a work plan, but they don't have a specific template required, you might fall back on something like this that you found did a great job of helping you represent and present your work plan in a way that made it easier for the reviewers to digest. In fact, maybe when you got your feedback sheets, you requested feedback from the grant maker when you got it, or if you were denied, maybe they said how clear it was to understand your work plan. Great, that's an indicator you should replicate use of that work plan in the future if you were asked for a work plan but not given a template to follow. The work plan is the place where you are starting to give more details so that the reviewers, again, are coming in from that 30,000-foot logic model view. They've been coming deeper with you as they went through your goal and your SMART objectives. This is where they're really starting to see what will this look like once the funding starts and you are off and running, implementing that funded project or program. When we think about program design, as I mentioned at the beginning of this module, not all of us that are grant writers or grant professionals are also program design specialists, program directors, vice president of programs. That's not necessarily the case. So be sure that you bring your team to the table and that you're looking for resources on how to facilitate program design conversations, and that you're asking for input from your colleagues at all stages so that what you put forward as your design elements to grant makers is as clear as possible to as many different perspectives and backgrounds as possible. Now, you've got my email in order to ask questions, but there's also lots of other ways to connect, and I'm happy to do so and continue to share resources with you wherever you're comfortable and present. If, however, you've got a question, whether it was on logic models or SMART objectives or now about work plans, please feel free to reach out at any time. My direct email is diane@dhleonardconsulting.com. Thank you for participating in this particular module about program design elements, and a big thank you to the funders who have helped make these online grant training modules available to you. Please be sure to check out the other modules so that if you complete all of them, you're able to receive your certificate of completion.